phone rang at 5:40 on a Thursday, and my little brother's voice came through it, already broken. They said no, Mara. They said they just bought a boat. I was 34 years old, standing in a gravel boatyard in Milwaukee with a clipboard under my arm and a survey half finished on a 30-foot sloop. Gabe was 27, lying in a hospital bed 2 counties north of me with his right hand crushed flat between a winch drum and a steel cleat. The surgeon needed $12,000 and a yes inside 18 days, or the bones would knit wrong, and the hand he made his whole living with would close into a claw for the rest of his life. I hadn't spoken to our parents in 9 years. On the call, I could hear my mother somewhere behind him, half into the speaker, saying the thing she always said, light as anything, like she was commenting on the weather. He's always been careless with his hands. Maybe this one'll finally teach him to slow down. Then the line went quiet, and in that quiet, some cold professional part of me started doing math. Because here is the thing I know better than almost anyone alive. I know exactly what a boat costs. I survey boats for a living. And what I found 3 days later, in the bottom of my grandmother's old varnished ditty box, turned that quiet on the phone into the most expensive mistake my parents ever made. Welcome back to Suspense Stories, where the daughter who left without a word comes home with the one thing nobody on this earth can argue with: the paperwork. If you have ever watched one half of a family spend like kings while telling the other half there's nothing left, if you've ever heard, "We just can't help right now," from people whose new toy is tied up gleaming at the dock, then stay with me, because tonight a folder gets opened in front of an entire town. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. And do me one favor before we go any further: subscribe, because the next part of this is going to make your jaw drop. I want to tell you, I hesitated when Gabe called. I didn't. 9 years of silence cracked open in 30 seconds, and the strange thing was how steady my hand stayed. That's what my job does to you. I spend my days crawling through bilges and tapping hulls, finding the place where a boat stops matching the story the seller tells about it. After enough years, you stop flinching at the gap between what people say and what's under the paint. You measure it and write it down. So when Gabe said the word boat, the cold part of me filed it before the rest of me could feel the heat. A new boat costs a great deal more than $12,000. I asked my brother to slow down and tell me everything. A mooring line had parted under load at the marina where he worked. The bitter end whipped a steel cleat back through a winch, and his right hand was in the wrong 6 inches of the world when it happened. The ER stabilized him, but the hand surgeon, a blunt woman named Dr. Mensa, wanted to rebuild it with pins and a plate and a tendon repair. And his marina insurance left a $12,000 hole he couldn't climb out of in time. "Mara," he said, and his voice did the thing it used to do when we were kids, and he was trying not to cry in front of his big sister. I didn't know who else to call. I told him I'd be there by morning. I did not tell him why I'd left in the first place. That was a longer story, and it was about to become the whole story. Here is the version my parents told the neighbors for 9 years. Mara got proud. Mara went off and got herself a license and a city job, and decided her family wasn't good enough for her. Mara abandoned us. They told it so many times, I think they came to believe it. The way you come to believe a number you've written in the same box for a decade. The truth was smaller and a great deal uglier. When I was 25, fresh out of my surveying apprenticeship and still living up in Kestrel Bay in my parents' orbit, my grandmother asked me to help her sort her papers. Nana Solveig was sharp as a fillet knife right to the end, but her hands had started to tremble, and she trusted mine. We sat at her kitchen table with the lake going gray outside the window, and I found something that didn't close. There was money, real money, from the sale of my grandfather's fishing boat and the little fish house he'd worked out of for 40 years. Nana swore she'd set every dollar of it aside for me and Gabe. But the account she pointed me to held barely a few thousand, and there were withdrawals against it she said she'd never made. When I asked my father about it, calm as anything, just one granddaughter asking one quiet question, he went a color I'd never seen on him. He told me I was confused. He told me Nana was getting forgetful, that I shouldn't take an old woman's bookkeeping as gospel. And my mother took me into the kitchen, folded a dish towel into a perfect square the way she does, and said in that low, even voice she saves for threats dressed up as advice, "Don't go digging in things that aren't yours, Mara. It only makes trouble." I was 25. I had no copies, no standing, no proof, just a hole in a ledger I'd watched with my own eyes, and a whole family telling me I was imagining it. So I did the thing that felt like survival. I took a job offer in Milwaukee, packed one bag, and stopped answering the phone. For 9 years, I told myself I'd simply moved on and built a better life. And I had built a life carefully, plank by plank, the way you build a boat that has to keep you alive in cold water. But I never once forgot the ledger that wouldn't close. And now, my brother needed $12,000 to save his hand, and my parents had just bought themselves a brand new boat. I drove the 110 miles north to Kestrel Bay before the sun was fully up over Lake Michigan. It's a small harbor town in the northeast corner of Wisconsin, the kind of place where everybody knows whose slip is whose and whose marriage is taking on water. The regional hospital sat one county over in Harbor City. Gabe looked smaller than I remembered, propped up with his forearm wrapped and elevated. He grabbed my fingers and held on like he was 9. Dr. Mensa came through on her rounds and didn't waste a syllable. She put the films up and showed me the wreck of it, the crushed bones, the torn tendon, the plate and pins it would take to put a working hand back where a hand belongs. "Insurance covers most of the stay," she said. "What's left is the surgical fee and the hardware. About $12,000 up front, and there's a clock. Bone and tendon don't wait. Maybe 18 days before things start setting the way they're sitting now. After that, we're talking about a hand that won't close right, chronic pain, and a man who can't hold a welding torch or a caulking iron ever again. $12,000, 18 days, a boatwright's right hand." I asked Gabe gently what our father had said when he called him. My brother looked at the ceiling a moment before he could get it out. He said they couldn't swing it right now. A pause. He said they'd just put money down on a new boat. I have crawled through 100 filthy bilges and never once wanted to put my fist through a hull the way I did right then. I kept my voice level. I told my brother not to think about the money for one more minute, that I'd handle it. And then I drove out to see our parents. The house I grew up in sits on a rise above the water, and the first thing I saw coming down the drive was the boat. Enormous, a big white fiberglass cabin cruiser, all chrome rail and tinted glass, obscene against the gray morning. The name was already lettered across the transom in gold script. Liberty Belle. My father came out onto the porch before I reached the steps, and for a long moment we just looked at each other across 9 years. He'd gone soft and prosperous in the middle. My mother appeared behind him, drying her hands, and her face didn't move at all when she saw me, which told me everything about how much she'd missed me. "Well," she said, "look who finally remembered the road home." I didn't come to fight. I came to confirm a thing I already suspected, so I said it plainly. "Gabe needs $12,000 for surgery inside 18 days, or he loses the use of his hand for good. Will you help him?" My father spread his hands and started in about cash flow, about everything being tied up right now, about how you can't just pull 12,000 out of the air, about how the season had been slow. Behind him, that boat creaked softly against its lines. My mother folded her dish towel into its perfect square. "He should have been paying closer attention on that dock," she said. "Gabe's always been careless. Maybe a bad handle finally teach him to think." There it was again, the same shrug, the same sentence, smooth as a stone she kept in her pocket just to throw. I looked at my father, then at the boat, then at my mother's folded towel, and that old ledger that wouldn't close opened up again in the back of my mind, very quietly, like a hatch I'd walked past for 9 years. I didn't argue. Arguing with my parents was like arguing with a north wind. It changed nothing and left you cold and wet. I drove to a diner out on the county road and ordered a coffee I never drank. Then I called the hospital's billing office and asked exactly what it would take to guarantee Gabe his surgery. Because I had the money. That isn't a brag. It's the whole reason this story is even possible to tell. I'd spent 9 years living below my means, building the kind of cushion that lets a person say yes when it counts. I told the billing office to book the procedure the instant doctor. Mensa had an opening. Just like that, the clock stopped being a sentence on my brother's hand. But sitting in that booth with my cold coffee, I couldn't let go of one thing. My grandmother used to pat my hand and say, "Don't you fret about you and your brother. I've got it set by. I made sure of it." I'd always assumed she meant a little savings, a few thousand for a funeral, the kind of thing that gets spent and forgotten. But Gabe had just hit exactly the emergency Nana would have meant. And there'd been nothing. No fund, no envelope, no call from my parents saying their grandmother had set something aside for just this, just a boat named Liberty Belle and a mother who thought a ruined hand was a teaching moment. I drove to Gabe's apartment that night with one question turning over in my head. What exactly had my grandmother set by, and where on God's gray lake had it gone? Gabe's apartment was one room above a bait shop, clean and nearly bare. I helped him onto the couch, and we talked the way we hadn't in years. He told me what the last 9 years had really been like in their shadow, how Mom and Dad were always tight, always sighing about a fixed income. Whenever he needed anything real, a semester at the technical college, a cosign on a used truck, rent the winter the marina laid him off. And yet, there was the base boat 2 summers back, the camper they hauled to the Ozarks every fall, the granite kitchen. He'd stopped asking by the time he was 22, because asking only earned him a lecture about how soft his generation had gotten. "They tell everybody at church they gave us everything," he said, picking at a thread with his good hand. "Mrs. Vesterberg stopped me at the gas station once to say how lucky we were, how generous Mom and Dad have always been." I just stood there holding a gallon of milk. The whole town thought Carl and Inga Larson had bled themselves dry for their kids. The whole town had it exactly backwards. I asked Gabe if he remembered Nana ever talking about money she'd put away for us. He went still. "Yeah," he said slowly. "She told me the same thing she told you, that there was something set by. I always figured it just went to the funeral." I didn't say anything, but I had already decided I was going to go find it. The next morning I did what I do for a living, except this time the client was a dead woman, and the vessel under survey was my own family. I started with public records. Kestrel Bay sits in Bray County, and the recorder's office is a sleepy little room with a clerk who was glad to have somebody to talk to. I pulled my grandmother's probate file. Solveig Larsson had passed 9 years back, the same spring I left. Her will was short, and most of it went to my father, her only living child. But there was a line in that file that made me set my paper cup down on the counter. It referred to a separate instrument recorded the same year, 2 full years before she died. Not a vague promise, not a savings passbook, a formal, recorded trust with names on it. I requested it and waited while the clerk ran it off the microfilm reader, the old machine humming and clunking like it resented being asked. When the pages came out of the tray still warm, I read them right there at the counter, and the floor seemed to tilt under me. The Solveig Larsson Family Trust, established for the medical and educational needs of my grandchildren, Mara Larsson and Gabriel Larsson, funded at creation with $56,000 from the sale of my late husband's fishing vessel and shore property. $56,000 for our medical and our educational needs. By name, I read it 3 times because wanting is the enemy of an honest survey. But the words didn't change. My grandmother hadn't left us a vague little cushion. She'd left a small fortune by the measure of working people like us, wrapped it in legal armor, and addressed it to me and my brother by name. And in 9 years, not $1 of it had reached either of us. I needed to know who held the helm. The trust named 2 trustees, my father, Carl Larsson, and a man named Vern Brower. I'll come back to Vern, because Vern is where this stops being sad and starts being a crime. But first, I made the mistake of going to see my sister. Britt is 3 years older than me, and she's the one who stayed when I ran. She married a local man, had 2 kids, and spent the better part of a decade hauling our parents to appointments and managing their moods. I found her in her driveway wrestling grocery bags out of her minivan, and the second she saw me, her face closed up like a cash drawer at the end of a shift. "So you came back for the drama," she said. I told her I'd come back for Gabe, the surgery, the $12,000, the boat. She didn't look surprised. She looked tired all the way to the bone. "Mom and Dad don't have it to give, Mara. You don't know what their bills are like." I asked her very evenly whether their bills included a $52,000 cabin cruiser. Her jaw tightened. That's their business. And then she said it, the family liturgy, the exact sentence I'd now heard out of 2 of them in 3 days. Gabe needs to learn to stand on his own 2 feet. Maybe a bad hand'll teach him to slow down. She didn't even hear herself say it. It had become wallpaper to her, a thing you repeat without listening, and I understood that my sister wasn't a villain so much as a deckhand who'd long ago stopped asking what the voyage was even for. I asked her one more thing. "Did you know Nana set up a trust for me and Gabe? $56,000 in our names." Britt's hands went dead still on the grocery bag. For 1 second, something flickered behind her eyes, something that knew. Then she said, "I don't know what you're talking about," and carried her bags inside and shut the door. Her hands had told me more than her mouth ever would. She knew about the trust, which meant the silence around it wasn't an accident. It was a household policy, so I went looking for the lawyer who drafted the thing. The trust carried the name of a small local firm, Haverson and Reed, the kind of practice that handles half the town's wills and minds none of the town's business. I made an appointment with old Mr. Haverson himself. He remembered my grandmother warmly. He remembered drafting the trust. But the moment I asked to see an accounting, Where the 56,000 had gone, what was left? He got careful in the way lawyers get careful when they realize they're standing close to a conflict of interest. "Mara, I drafted the instrument," he said. "But your father and Mr. Brower administer it. As a named beneficiary, you have a right to a full accounting. But I can't simply hand you the trustees' records. You'd have to demand them formally. And, frankly," he chose it carefully, "your father has been a client of this firm a long while. I'm not the man to take this on for you." It was a wall, but an honest wall, and it told me two things worth more than gold. One, that as a named beneficiary, I had a clean legal right to compel a full accounting. And two, that I'd have to do it through somebody with no loyalty to my father in their blood. I thanked him and stood to go. At the door, he said quietly, "Solveig would have wanted those children looked after. She told me so the day she signed." "I know," I said. "I'm going to make sure she gets her wish." While I was building my case, my brother's hand was not waiting on the law. Dr. Mensa called me on a Friday. The bones were already showing the first signs of setting wrong. That 18-day window was really more like 10 now. If we wanted the best outcome, the surgery needed to happen that week. I did not wait 1 minute for any trust to come through. I wired the full surgical deposit that same afternoon out of my own savings and told them to book the first slot doctor. Mensa had. I want to say this plainly because it matters more than anything else here. I never once gambled my brother's hand on winning a legal fight. The trust was justice, and justice can take its time. My own money was the rescue, and rescue cannot. Gabe cried when I told him it was scheduled. Not about the hand, he said, about the fact that somebody had just handled it. No lecture, no conditions, no speech about responsibility. He'd forgotten what that felt like. I drove back to the motel, not under my parents' roof. I would not sleep under that roof again, and laid the trust deed and my brother's surgery confirmations side by side on the bedspread. One was the wound, one the bandage, and between them sat a single question I now had the legal right to force into daylight. Where had every dollar of that 56,000 gone, and whose hand had signed it away? If you're still with me, do me a quick favor. It genuinely helps Suspense calm stories more than you know. If you've ever been told there was nothing left by someone who somehow always had plenty for themselves, type the words "show them this" in the comments. That's a line you'll understand completely in a few minutes. And subscribe, because the part where I find out who held the pen is coming right now. The second trustee was a man named Vern Brower, and the moment I started pulling on that thread, the whole knot got tighter and a great deal dirtier. Vern owned Brower Marine, the boat dealership and brokerage right there on the Kestrel Bay waterfront. He and my father had been friends for 30 years, the kind that runs almost entirely on favors. My father had steered years of business his way. Half the lake families bought their outboards and insured their hulls through Brower Marine because Carl Larson put in the good word. And then I found the thing that made my stomach drop. The boat. Liberty Belle. My parents had bought it from Brower Marine. Let that sit. A co-trustee is supposed to be a check on the other, the second signature that stops one man from raiding a fund meant for 2 kids. But a co-trustee who owes you his livelihood and who sold you the very boat in question is not a check on anything. He's a rubber stamp with a sales commission. I didn't have the bank records yet, but I'd have bet my license that every withdrawal carried 2 signatures, my father's and the signature of a man who was never going to tell him no. And it made me think of my grandmother, who was nobody's fool. She'd named 2 trustees on purpose, precisely because she didn't fully trust her own son around money meant for her grandchildren. She'd built a safeguard right into the hull, and my father had quietly defeated it by choosing a partner who was bought and paid for before the ink was dry. The cruelty of that sat in my chest like a stone in cold water. Nana had reached out from the grave to protect us, and they'd picked her lock with a smile. I didn't feel like crying. I felt like a surveyor who just found, under a fresh coat of bright white paint, the exact place where the wood had rotted clean through. Now, I just had to peel the paint back in front of someone who couldn't look away. The break in the case didn't come from a courthouse. It came from a tackle box. I was at Gabe's apartment, helping him sort through cartons he'd hauled out of our parents' attic years before, when he said, almost offhand, "Nana's old ditty box is in that one, if you want it." I'd forgotten the thing existed. A small varnished wooden chest, brass-cornered, the kind that used to ride in the cuddy of a working boat. When I lifted the lid, the smell came up and nearly took my legs out from under me, cedar and old diesel, and a ghost of the rose water she wore. Inside were her reading glasses, a tied bundle of birthday cards she'd never had the chance to send, and at the very bottom, wrapped in a square of flour sack towel, a manila envelope my hands knew before my brain did. Inside was my grandmother's own signed original of the trust deed, not the recorder's grainy scan, the real document, and clipped to it, a letter in her shaking hand, both our names across the top. She wrote that she'd sold Grandpa Toby's fishing boat and the fish house after he was gone, so there'd be money for our schooling and our doctors. Because she put this down plainly, she had watched her son around $1 his whole life and did not trust him to think of us. She'd named Vern as a second signer and prayed it would be enough. And then she wrote the line I'll hear in her voice until the day they put me in the ground. If anyone ever tells you the wells run dry, child, you show them this. Your grandpa and I didn't pull fish out of that cold, black water for 40 years, so the two of you could ever go without. I sat down on Gabe's floor and read it out loud to him, and my steady surveyor's voice, the one that doesn't shake reading a sinking report, finally cracked clean in half on that last sentence. 9 years in the ground, and my grandmother had reached up out of that ditty box and put the exact weapon I needed into my hands. Not a rumor, not a feeling. Her own signed deed and her own written intent, naming me and my brother out loud. I had the truth now. All I had left to do was set the table, with my own lawyer's help, and I'll get to her. I finally pried the trust's bank records loose. And then I did the thing I'm genuinely, deeply good at. I sat at the motel desk with the deed on my left and 9 years of statements on my right, and I reconciled them line by line. It's tedious work. It's also the kind that simply cannot lie to you. The $56,000 had come into the account the year Nana created it, exactly as the deed said. And then, about a year after she died, it began to leave. Not all at once. That's how people who are stealing tell themselves they're only borrowing. A few thousand here, a few thousand there. And every withdrawal carried 2 signatures, just as I'd known, my father's and Vern Brower's. Then I did the thing an ordinary accountant couldn't have done. I matched the money to the boats, because I know vessels. I pulled the public registration on that cabin cruiser, ran the hull identification number, found the bill of sale and the marine loan paperwork through channels I use every working week. And there it was. Liberty Belle had been bought with a small loan and 1 large cash down payment. I matched the dates. 9,000 withdrawn the month their kitchen got its granite. 11,000 the spring before the camper. And then the one that set my jaw, the single largest withdrawal in 9 years, drained out of my grandmother's trust just 11 weeks before that cash down payment landed at Brower Marine. And a gold-lettered boat appeared at my parents' dock. Fund was nearly empty. A little under $4,000 left of my grandmother's 56, the leftovers of a gift that was supposed to put 2 kids through school and catch them when they got hurt. They hadn't spent it on us. They'd spent it on the granite and the camper, and most of all, on the boat. The hole in the ledger I'd seen at 25 finally had a bottom, and I was standing on it. And then I found the part my grandmother, wherever she is, would have appreciated most, because the cruelest joke in this whole business is that I had already touched that boat 18 months earlier. A marine insurer I do regular work for sent me a routine pre-binding survey on a used cabin cruiser changing hands at a brokerage up the lakeshore. I do dozens a year. I never matched the buyer's name to my own family because the deal ran through an LLC and Brower Marine, and I had no cause to look. I'd walked that hull, tapped that deck, photographed that very hull identification number, and signed a valuation report, my name, my license number, my seal, putting the boat's market value at right around $52,000. I had surveyed my parents' stolen boat and certified what it was worth with my own hand before I ever knew it was bought with my grandmother's stolen money. When I realized it, I pulled my own report from my files. There was the date. There was the hull number matching the bill of sale to the digit. There was my signature, certifying that this gleaming object was worth almost exactly the sum that had drained out of 2 children's trust. My grandmother left me the letter. My own profession left me the receipt. The only gift was the love at the bottom of the box. My mother found out I'd been to the recorder's office and to Old Haverson's. In a town the size of Kestrel Bay, you can't pull a microfilm without somebody's cousin mentioning it at the diner. She called me Saturday morning, her voice in that low, even register she uses when she wants a thing to stop. "Don't you embarrass this family, Mara." There it was. Not "don't lie," not "don't slander us." Don't embarrass us, as though the shameful thing was the looking and not the missing money underneath. I asked, gently, why she'd be embarrassed by me reading a public document. And then she made the kind of slip people make when they're certain they hold every card. "That money went to things this family needed," she said. "You weren't here." Then she caught herself. "There's nothing for you to find. Leave it be." But it was too late. She'd confirmed the one thing I still doubted. There had been money. She'd admitted it in the past tense, that money, and told me it was spent. I told her, very calmly, that I'd leave it alone if she could show me one piece of paper proving the trust had been spent on me or Gabe. She hung up. I took that silence as my answer, a quick word to those of you still with me, and thank you truly. The people who hurt you will almost always have a reason that sounds perfectly fine in their own mouths. We couldn't afford it. We did what we had to. You weren't here. Don't waste your breath arguing with the reason. Find the paper underneath it. If this is landing somewhere real for you, comment 2 signatures, because in a minute you'll see exactly why those 2 words matter. Vern Brower found me the morning everything came to a head. He was waiting beside my car in the motel lot, sweating through a golf shirt in the cool of the morning, his eyes doing the nervous arithmetic of a man who's just figured out which way the wind has clocked around. "Mara, let's be reasonable here." Somehow he'd heard I had the accounting. He offered me a deal right there on the asphalt. He'd personally see to it, quietly, that the trust got made whole out of his own pocket if it came to that, if I'd just call off whatever I was planning and keep his name out of it. "I've got a business, a reputation," he said. "Your dad talked me into co-signing those. Every one of them. I never saw a dime of that money, I swear to you. I was doing a friend a favor, and there it was." The second confession in 2 days, handed to me for free in a parking lot. He just admitted, out loud, that my father directed every withdrawal, and that he, Vern, the safeguard, the second signature my grandmother had prayed would be enough, had signed off on money he knew full well wasn't theirs to move. I almost thanked him, but I did not take his deal, because a quiet fix was exactly what my parents wanted. The money slipped back into the account in the dark. The boat kept. The story buried. The whole town still believing the Larsons were good and generous people, and their younger daughter was just bitter. That isn't justice. That's a fresh coat of paint over the same rot, and I've spent my whole career teaching people the difference. I told Vern the trust would be made whole through the court, in the open, and that he was welcome to bring his own lawyer. He called me a name I won't repeat as I got in my car. I didn't mind. A man only gets that ugly when he already knows he's going down. My lawyer was a woman named Lois Becker, 2 towns over in Harbor City, far enough from Kestrel Bay that she'd never once shaken my father's hand. She was in her 50s, plain-spoken, and she read my reconciliation with the slow appreciation of someone who knew how rare it is for a beneficiary to walk in with the math already finished and the hull number already matched. "Most people come to me with a feeling," she said, turning a page. "You came to me with a survey." She laid it out in clean legal terms. What my father and Vern Brower had done was a textbook breach of fiduciary duty. As trustees, they were bound to spend that money only on me and Gabe. Diverting it into a kitchen, a camper, a boat wasn't a gray area. It was self-dealing. As a named beneficiary, I had standing to compel a full accounting, to sue for restitution of every diverted dollar, and to ask a judge to remove them both as trustees. Given how clean the documentation was, she fully expected a court to order repayment, and very possibly to put a lien on assets bought with the money to secure it. A lien on assets, I asked, just to be sure I understood whether that could include a boat. She almost smiled. "If trust funds can be traced straight to its purchase, and yours can, down to the down payment, absolutely. The court can tie up that vessel until every dollar comes home." So I had it, not a miracle. A case, built plank by plank, with my own 2 hands. The only thing left to decide was where, and in front of whom I'd lay it down. Before I set the table, I gave my sister one last chance to get up from it. I drove to Britt's house and showed her a single page. 1 bank statement, 1 withdrawal, 2 signatures. Dated the same month our parents put the granite in their kitchen. I didn't say a word. I just let her look. Britt sat down at her own kitchen table like her legs had quit on her. For a long moment, she didn't speak. And when she did, there was none of the family liturgy left in her voice. "I knew there was money," she said. "I didn't know it was that much. I swear to God I didn't know it was yours and Gabe's by name." And then she told me something I hadn't seen coming. 2 summers back, drowning after her husband's hours got cut, she'd gone to our parents for help, and they'd given her $4,000 out of the trust. She understood now, though they never told her where it came from. "They made me feel like I owed them my life for it," she whispered. "Every holiday since, and it wasn't even theirs to give. It was yours. It was Gabe's." For 1 clean second, I saw my sister whole. Not a villain, a woman who'd stayed and been bled, and then been made grateful for her own stolen blood. But feeling for someone is not the same as being able to count on them. When I asked Britt whether she'd stand with me when it counted, She looked at her kids' drawings on the refrigerator and said, "I can't, Mara. They're my children's grandparents. I have to live in this town." She chose silence. I understood it. I even forgave it. But I quietly crossed her off the short list of people I could lean on and drove back to the motel alone. Gabe's surgery happened on a Wednesday, and it went well. Dr. Mensah came out and told me she'd gotten the bones and the tendon back where they belonged. That with the plate and pins and a long year of rehab, he'd have a working hand again. That he'd hold a torch and a caulking iron and a coffee cup like a man who'd never been hurt. I sat in that waiting room and felt the first clean thing I'd felt in weeks. My brother's hand was saved. Whatever else happened, that much was already true, and nothing my parents did could take it back. But by then they'd learned I wasn't going away quietly. My father called that same evening, and the soft, prosperous man from the porch was gone. "I don't know what you think you dug up," he said, "but you go spreading lies about this family, and I will sue you for slander. You hear me? I'll take you for everything you've got." It was a bluff, and a clumsy one. You cannot sue a person for slander over a thing that's true and documented and stamped with 2 signatures. But it told me he was scared, and scared men make noise. He worked the phones all over town, telling anyone who'd hold still that his bitter daughter had come home to tear a good family apart over nothing. He even called Gabe's hospital room fishing for sympathy. And my brother, still groggy from the anesthesia, told him to lose the number. So now there were 2 stories loose in Kestrel Bay. My father's, in which I was the jealous one come to wreck a family, and mine, sitting quiet in a folder, in which a grandmother's gift to 2 grandchildren had been quietly devoured plank by plank. The town would choose which to believe, and I already knew the exact moment I'd force the choice, because my parents, in their endless arrogance, had built that moment for me themselves. My parents were throwing a party. A christening, they called it, for the boat. They'd invited half of Kestrel Bay neighbors, the church crowd, my father's old business friends, the pastor who'd baptized me. There'd be bunting along the dock, cheap champagne sweating in plastic flutes, and a little ceremony where my father would break a bottle across the bow of Liberty Belle and make a speech about hard work and good fortune. It was, when you sat with it, the single most arrogant thing they could have done. They were going to stand up in front of their whole community and celebrate the boat they'd bought with my grandmother's stolen gift, the very boat they'd named as their reason for letting my brother's hand rot. And every soul at that party believed they were good people. That was the arena. Not a courtroom where my father could hide behind a quiet settlement and a sealed file. The dock, in front of every person whose good opinion he'd spent that stolen money to buy. I called Lois Becker and told her my plan. She was quiet a moment, then said, "Legally, I file the petition Monday morning no matter what you do. But what you do at that party, that's not my department. I'll tell you one thing. Don't say a single word out there you can't put on paper." I told her every word I planned to say was already on paper. I had copies made, the trust deed, Nana's letter, the reconciliation, the bank statements with their 2 signatures, even my own 18-month-old survey report with the hull number circled, and the soft, worn original from the ditty box, which I'd read out loud. I was not going to scream. I was not going to call anybody names. I was going to stand up at their party very calmly and let my grandmother finally have the last word. She'd been denied for 9 years. My mother came to my motel the night before the christening. I don't know how she found out where I was staying, but Kestrel Bay keeps no secrets. There she was at my door at 9 in the evening, smaller than I remembered, her hands worrying the strap of her purse. For one foolish second, I thought she'd come to confess. I should have known better. She'd come to manage me, darted soft. Mara, sweetheart, whatever you think you found, this isn't who we are, we're your family. When soft didn't move me, she slid into grievance. After everything we did, we fed you, we raised you, and this is the thanks. And then, when grievance didn't move me either, she reached for the old stone in her pocket, except this time she aimed it square at me. Your brother brought that hand on himself. And you always did think you were better than this family. Maybe a little humility would teach you some responsibility. There it was. The family's favorite weapon finally turned all the way around and pointed at me. I didn't take the bait. I asked her one quiet question. Mom, did you spend Nana's trust on yourselves? Her face did something complicated. For 1/2 second, I genuinely think she considered telling me the truth. Then her chin came up. That money was ours to manage, she said. You don't understand the first thing about how it worked. Ours to manage, not ours to keep, not we never touched it. Even now, cornered, she could only justify, she could not deny. I told her I'd see her at the party. She left without another word, and I watched her taillights go down the county road, and I felt no triumph at all. Just a tired, bone-deep certainty. Tomorrow, the town would understand all of it perfectly. The christening was on a Saturday, and I marked it on my calendar like a surgery date. In the days before, I did the unglamorous work that real justice runs on. Lois drafted a formal demand and a petition for an accounting and restitution, ready to file Monday. I assembled the family version of the evidence, not legal jargon, but the plain human timeline anybody standing on a dock with a plastic cup could follow in 30 seconds. I practiced saying it out loud until I could do it without my voice ever climbing. That was the discipline that mattered most, because I knew my parents. The second I raised my voice, they'd have their escape hatch. There's Mara, hysterical, bitter, just like we always told you. So I rehearsed calm the way other people rehearse a wedding toast. And I'll be honest, part of me wanted to do it cruel, to wait until my father was mid-speech and cut his legs out from under him. But my grandmother hadn't written that letter out of spite. She'd written it out of love. So I decided I'd let her letter do the cutting, and I'd just stand there and hold the paper. I laid out clothes that said respectable, not vengeful, a plain blouse, my hair down. When you're about to tell the truth in front of 100 people, you don't want to look like the villain they were warned about. You want to look like exactly what you are. Their daughter, with the receipts. The dock was beautiful. I'll give them that. Bunting in red and white, a long table of food, champagne sweating in plastic flutes. 40 or 50 people in their summer best. Liberty Belle rode high and gleaming at the end of it all. A bottle of cheap sparkling wine hung from her bow on a ribbon, waiting for the breaking. I saw the pastor. I saw Mrs. Vesterberg, who'd once praised our parents' generosity at a gas pump. I saw an old man in a worn captain's cap sitting apart near the seawall, Sven Alto, 80 years old, who'd fished alongside my grandfather Toby for 30 seasons and now barely left his porch. And I saw my mother in a new blue dress and my father holding court by the stern, a man at the absolute peak of the life he had bought. My father spotted me, his smile pulled tight, but he wasn't about to make a scene at his own triumph. So he just nodded at me, cold, and turned back to his guests. Let her watch, his shoulders said. Let her see everything we have. I took a flute of champagne I had no intention of drinking and stood at the edge of the gathering and waited. The calm wasn't numbness. I felt every bit of it. The ditty box, my brother's wrapped arm, the 9 years of silence. But I'd decided weeks before that I'd carry all of it quietly, because the loudest thing on that dock was going to be the truth. My father tapped a fork against his glass. The crowd hushed. He started in about family and sacrifice and the rewards of a life lived honest. I set my untouched champagne down. I took the folder out from under my arm, and I started toward the front. And I'll tell you, my father was saying, warming to it now, one hand on the rail of his boat, nobody ever handed us a single thing. Everything you see here, Inga and I built with our own 2 hands. We raised our kids to know that. You work, you sacrifice, and the good Lord provides. A murmur of approval. Somebody lifted a flute. So before we christen her, he said, patting the hull, I just want to thank every one of you for being the kind of community that. Excuse me, I didn't shout it. I said it the way you'd say it reaching past somebody at a table for the salt, and that was exactly why it cut straight through. Heads turned. My father's smile froze. I stepped into the open space at the front of the dock, beside the bow of Liberty Belle, and I turned not to him, but to the guests. I'm Mara, I said, Carl and Inga's younger daughter. Most of you knew my grandmother, Solveig Larsen. A few warm nods at her name. I won't take but a minute of your evening. I've just got one thing to share, and then I'll let you get back to the party. My father's voice came out low and dangerous. Mara, this is not the time. It'll only take a minute, Dad. I kept my tone mild, almost gentle, and I watched the exact moment the crowd registered the difference between his rising heat and my quiet. Watched them lean, just slightly, toward the calm one. My mother had gone white by the food table. Britt stood near the back with her hand pressed over her mouth. I opened the folder, but I didn't pull out the spreadsheet first. I pulled out the soft, worn envelope from the ditty box and held it up just enough for the front rows to see the shaking handwriting on the front. This is a letter my grandmother wrote, I said. I'd like to read you a part of it, and I read it in the plainest voice I owned. I read the part where she explained she'd sold Grandpa Toby's fishing boat and the fish house after he passed. I read the part where she set the money aside, $56,000, for her grandchildren, Mara and Gabriel, by name. And then I read the last line. If anyone ever tells you the wells run dry, child, you show them this. Your grandpa and I didn't pull fish out of that cold black water for 40 years, so the 2 of you could ever go without. The dock had gone completely, perfectly silent. Even the water seemed to hold still against the pilings. Over by the seawall, old Sven Alto had taken off his captain's cap and was holding it against his chest. I folded the letter, slid it back into its sleeve, and only then opened the folder and began laying the rest out on the food table, in plain sight, 1 page at a time, like a dealer turning over cards. My grandmother left a trust, I said, $56,000. My father and Mr. Brower were the 2 trustees. I set down the deed. Here's the account it went into. The first statement. And here is where it went. I laid them in a slow row. 9,000 the month. This family's kitchen got its granite. 11,000 the spring before the camper. And the single largest withdrawal of all. I set down the last page and finally turned to look directly at my father and let the silence hold 1 full beat. Drained out of 2 children's trust 11 weeks before this boat arrived at that dock. Nobody moved, Mrs. Vesterberg was staring down at the statements. The pastor had quietly set his flute on the table. 3 weeks ago, I said, my brother asked these 2 people for $12,000 to save his hand. The hand he makes his living with, and they told him no. They told him they'd just bought a new boat. They told him a bad hand might teach him to slow down. I looked around at the faces of the people my parents had spent that money to impress. I just thought, I said, that the folks being asked to raise a glass to this boat ought to know whose it really is. It was theirs. It was Gabe's. It was mine. It was my grandmother's love, and they spent it on a party. That was when my father came apart. How dare you? He roared it, and the sound bounced off the flat water and came back twice as ugly. He came toward me with his face gone purple, a finger stabbing the air. You ungrateful, jealous, you come to my party, you stand on my dock, and you spread your filthy lies in front of my friends. After everything we gave you, spit flew. A flute went off the edge of the table and cracked on the planking. My mother found her voice, and it climbed straight into a shriek. She's lying. She's always been like this. All of you know how she is. Bitter, always bitter, that one. They were both shouting now, over each other, at me, at the crowd. My father red and swelling. My mother's careful composure shattered into something raw and clawing. And here is the thing I had counted on, the entire reason I'd rehearsed calm for 3 nights running. I did not raise my voice. I did not shout back one single word. I just stood there beside my grandmother's letter, my hands quiet at my sides, and let the two of them be exactly as loud and ugly as they wanted, because the crowd could see, plain as the bank statements on the table, the difference between a woman reading her grandmother's words in a level voice and 2 people screaming that she was a liar while the paper sat there saying otherwise. My father lunged and grabbed for the folder. I let him take a page. It was a copy. I had 3 more sets and watched him crush it in his fist, which only made it worse because now he was a man visibly destroying evidence in front of his own pastor. Vern Brower was already gone. I caught him slipping up the lawn toward the cars. Abandoning his oldest friend the second the boat started down by the head. One by one, the guests stepped back from my parents, turning their shoulders, the warmth draining clean out of their faces. The performance was over. The audience had finally been let backstage, and then it was my sister who surprised me. Britt came forward from the back of the crowd, shaking. She didn't look at our parents. She looked at the neighbors, at the pastor, and she said it in a voice that barely held together. 2 summers ago, they gave me $4,000 when Pete lost his hours. They told me it was theirs. She swallowed. It wasn't, was it, Mara? It wasn't a question. It was a woman setting down a weight she'd carried for years, in front of everyone, at the worst possible moment, for the people who'd handed it to her. She didn't say another word. She just came and stood next to me, close enough that her arm touched mine, and that quiet defection did more damage to my parents than anything I'd laid on that table. My father ran out of breath before I ran out of calm. That's what always happens. Rage is a sprint. The truth is a long, slow walk, and it gets there every time. When he finally stood there panting, the crushed page still wadded in his fist, I stepped close enough that I didn't have to raise my voice at all, and said the only thing I'd really come there to say. Nana didn't leave you a boat, Dad. I let it sit. She left them a chance for Gabe to keep his hand without begging. A chance for both of us to get an education without going under. You took her chance, and you turned it into this. I gestured once at Liberty Belle, gold and gleaming, and suddenly the single most shameful object on that whole shoreline. Then I turned back to the guests and told them the rest in the same even tone. That on Monday morning, my lawyer would file a petition in probate court for a full accounting and the return of every diverted dollar. That the court could order the money repaid. That it could put a lien on the assets bought with it, including I said, looking at no one and at everyone, that boat. And that my father and Vern Brower could both be removed as trustees for what they'd done. Gabe already had his surgery, I added. I paid for it myself 2 weeks ago, the same week these two told him to learn to live with a claw. So understand me, this was never about saving his hand. His hand is safe. This is only about the truth getting to stand up at the party too. My mother was crying now, the performing kind and the real kind all tangled together, reaching for the neighbors and finding only backs. My father had gone very quiet at last. The silence of a man doing arithmetic he should have done 9 years before. Over by the seawall, old Sven Alto put his captain's cap back on his head, slow and deliberate, and gave me one small nod across all that distance. And somehow that nod was worth more to me than the whole crowd combined. I picked up my grandmother's letter. I did not gloat. I didn't need to. I had laid her love out on a table in front of an entire town, and the whole town had finally read it. I walked back up the dock the way I'd come, past my untouched champagne, and not one person tried to stop me. Lois filed on Monday, exactly as promised. It never went to a dramatic trial. Cases like this rarely do once the documentation is airtight, and mine was as tight as a well-found hull. Faced with the trust deed, the reconciliation, my own survey report, and 2 signatures on every last withdrawal, my father's new lawyer advised him to settle. The court ordered restitution, and because the cash was long since spent on toys, a lien went straight onto the boat to secure it. Liberty Belle sat at that dock under a legal cloud for 1 more month, and there's nothing quite as sad as a trophy nobody is allowed to enjoy. Then she was sold, and the proceeds went exactly where my grandmother had meant them to go all along, into a restored trust for Gabe's rehab and for my someday children's schooling. Vern Brower resigned as trustee before they could remove him, but word of what he'd signed traveled through every Lake family he'd ever sold a hull or written a policy to. And a marine dealer in a small harbor town runs entirely on trust. Brower Marine never recovered. He sold the lot inside a year. My parents kept their house, but not their standing. The pastor stayed kind but distant. Mrs. Vesterberg never again told anyone how generous the Larsons were. The performance had a backstage now, and the whole town had seen it. Britt called me a week after the christening, crying, to say she was sorry she'd waited so long to stand up, though she had stood up in the end, at the only moment it truly cost her something. I told her I knew, and I meant it. We talk now, carefully, a little. That $4,000 she'd been made to feel grateful for had been eating her alive for 2 years, and saying it out loud on that dock was the first full breath she'd taken in a long time, and Gabe healed beautifully. By winter, he was out of the brace. By spring, he was back at the marina, holding a caulking iron in a right hand that worked like it had never been hurt. He framed a copy of Nana's letter and hung it over his couch, the very couch where this whole thing started with a phone call. If anyone ever tells you the wells run dry, it says, in her shaking hand. He says it makes him braver. It makes me braver too. There's one more thing. With a piece of the restored trust and a lot of weekends, Gabe and I tracked down Grandpa Toby's old wooden fishing boat, the real Solveig, the working tug Nana had named after herself, the one whose sale had funded the whole trust in the first place. She'd passed through 3 owners and was sitting half sunk and forgotten in a backwater slip up the shore. We bought her back. We're restoring her, plank by plank, the 2 of us, in a borrowed shed through the long Wisconsin winters. When she's sound again, and she will be sound, not just painted. There's a difference. And I would know we're going to put her back in the cold, black water my grandparents pulled a living out of for 40 years. Bring her home, Gabe says. That's the whole project in 2 words. Bring her home. People ask me sometimes if I regret it, if family isn't worth more than money in the end. But that was never the question, and it never is. The money was just how the truth finally got measured. The real question was always whether somebody would make my grandmother's last act of love mean something, or let it dissolve quietly into a boat. She trusted me to be the one who looked. If I'd stayed quiet, I'd have just been the 3rd signature. I'd have just been Vern. So here's what I know now, after all of it. Fresh paint hides rot. It never once fixes it. A boat that's truly sound will ride out any sea you can throw at her. And a boat that's all paint and gold lettering goes straight to the bottom in the first real blow, and so do families. Family isn't the blood you happen to share. It's the people who would never, ever let you go under to keep themselves afloat. And if there's someone in your life right now who keeps the receipts hidden and the reasons always close at hand, somebody who never has anything to spare for you while they spend freely on themselves, then don't waste one more year arguing with their reasons. Go find your grandmother's letter. Find the paper they're praying you'll never think to look for. The truth sits quiet down there under all that bright new paint. And sooner or later, child, it always floats up. That's how a grandmother's letter beat a brand new boat. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the dock. If this one moved you, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight, and subscribe to Suspense Stories for the next one. Comment, bring her home, if you believe some things are worth restoring, no matter how long they've been left to sink. I'll see you on the next one.